We were up the next morning with every faculty alert with interest and wonder for what that day would reveal. We have begun to look upon each day as a revelation of unfoldment in itself and felt that we were but beginning to realize the deep meaning of the things we were experiencing. While at breakfast that morning, we were told that we would go to a village higher up in the mountains, and from that place, we would visit the temple that was located on one of the mountains that I had seen while standing on the roof of the temple already described. We were told we would only be able to use our horse for 15 miles of the journey, and that two of the villagers would go forth. Two of the villagers would go with us that far and would take the horses to another village further on and care for them until we arrived. We turned our horses over to the two villagers at the appointed place and started to climb to the village up the narrow mountain trail, which at times proved to be steps hewn from the rock. We camped that night at a lodge located on the crest of a point about midway between the place where we had left the horses and the village of our destination. The keeper of the lodge was fat, old, and jolly. In fact, he was so plump and round that he seemed to roll rather than walk, and we could scarcely tell he had eyes. As soon as he had recognized Emil, he began asking for healing, saying, as we were told afterwards, that if he did not get help, he would surely die. We were told that he and his forefathers had kept this lodge and served the public for hundreds of years, and that he had been in charge about 70 years. About the time he took over the lodge, he was healed of what was called an inherited disease and supposed to be incurable. He had become a very active worker for about 2 years and gradually had lost interest and begun to depend upon others to help him out of his difficulties. This had gone on about 20 years, and he had seemed to prosper, seeming to enjoy the best of health, when suddenly he dropped back into his old ways, from which he would not make the necessary effort to arouse himself from his lethargy. We found that his case was only a fair example of thousands of others. These people live simply and easily, and anything that requires an effort becomes a burden to them very quickly. They soon lose interest, and their prayer for help becomes a mechanical sound instead of something other with deep meaning or desire. We were up and on our way early the next morning, and 4 o'clock in the afternoon found us at the village with the temple of our destination perched on a rocky pinnacle almost overhead. In fact, so steep were the walls that only means of approach was by a basket attached to a rope and let down on a pulley supported by a wooden beam made fast in the rocks. One end of the rope was attached to a windlass, and the other was passed over the pulley and fastened to the basket being let down and pulled up in this manner. The windlass was located in a little room hewn from solid rock of the ledge that jutted out so that it overhung the rock walls below. The wooden derrick to which the pulley was attached swung out so that the rope and basket just cleared the ledge, making it possible to haul the load up from below until it cleared. Then the basket and load were swung in and landed safely on top of the ledge in the little rock room hewed out for the purpose. This rock ledge jutted out over the rock walls below so far that the basket would swing out in midair from 50 to 60 feet as it traveled up and down. At a given signal, the basket was lowered, we stepped in and were hauled up, one by one, to the ledge 400 feet above. When we were landed upon this ledge, we began looking about for some trail leading on up to the temple, the walls of which we could see standing out flush with the walls of rock that still towered 500 feet above. We were told that we would make the ascent in a similar manner to that already described. As we looked, a derrick arm corresponding to the one on the ledge we were standing swung out. A rope was let down and attached to the same basket, and we were hauled up one by one and landed on the roof of the temple 500 feet above. I again felt as if we were on top of the world. The temple was located on a rocky pinnacle that stood out 900 feet above all of the surrounding mountains. The village we had left 900 feet below was located at the summit of a mountain pass used in crossing the Himalayas. We found that this temple was about 1,000 feet lower in elevation than the one I had visited with Emil and Jast, but it commanded a much wider outlook. From where we stood, it seemed as if we could look into infinite space. We were made comfortable for the night, and our three friends told us they were going to visit some of our associates and would take any message we wished to send. We wrote messages, carefully dating them, given our location, and including the time of day. And when we handed our friends these messages, they shook hands with us, saying they would see us in the morning, and disappeared one by one. We made careful note of the time and what it had written, and found afterwards that the messages were at their destination within 20 minutes of the time they had left our hands. After eating a hearty supper served by the attendants, we retired for the night, but not to sleep, for our experiences were beginning to make a deep impression upon us. Here we were nearly 9,000 feet in the air, with no human being near us except the attendants, not a sound except that of our own voices. There did not seem to be a breath of air stirring. One of my associates said, "Do you wonder why they choose the locations of these temples as places of meditation? The stillness is so intense one can fairly feel it. It certainly is a place in which to meditate." He then said he was going outside to have a look around. He went out but returned in a few moments, saying there was a heavy fog and nothing could be seen. My two associates were soon asleep, but I could not sleep, so I arose, dressed, and went out on the roof of the temple and sat down with my feet hanging over the wall. There was just enough moonlight filtered through the fog to illuminate the inky blackness that would have prevailed had not the moon been shining. There was just enough light to reveal the great billowy fog banks rolling by, enough to remind me that I was not suspended in space, that somewhere way down the earth was as ever, and that the place I was sitting upon was somehow connected with it. When all of a sudden it seems as if I could see a great pathway of light, its rays widening like a fan, with the wide part extending toward me. Where I was sitting seemed to be in about the center of the ever-widening ray, and the central ray was the most brilliant of them all. Each ray seemed to project onward in its course until it illuminated one part of the earth. Each illuminated its own particular portion of the earth until the whole blended in one great white ray. Looking far ahead, I could see all gradually converging until they ended in one central point of intense light, so white that it seemed transparent and crystal. Then, instantly, it seemed as if I stood out in space looking at it all. Looking far down the white ray, I could see what seemed to be specters of the faraway past marching on in ever-increasing numbers, but in solid ranks until they reached a certain place. Then they separated wider and wider until they filled the whole of the light. Until they filled the whole of the light ray and covered the entire earth. They all seemed to emerge at first from one central white point of light. They seemed to come forth from this point, first one, then just ahead were two, and just ahead of them were four, and so on until they reached a place of wide divergence, where they were about 100 abreast in solid fan-like array. When they came to the point of wide separation, they suddenly scattered widely and occupied all the light paths, and each marched on more or less alone until they seemed to occupy the whole earth. When they had occupied the whole earth, it seemed the rays had reached their widest expanse. Then they grew gradually narrower and narrower until the rays again converged into one point from which they had started. The cycle was complete and they entered again one by one. Before they entered, they formed a solid array, 100 abreast, gradually closing up until they became one, and that one entered the light alone. I suddenly aroused myself, and thinking that this was rather an unsafe place to be dreaming, I went in and retired. We have asked one of the attendants to call us at the first sign of daybreak, and almost before I knew it, there came a rap at the door. We all bounded out of bed, so eager were we to see the first break of day from our lofty perch. We were dressed in no time and went rushing out on the roof like three eager schoolboys. In fact, the noises we made so startled the attendants that they rushed up to see if we were really in our right minds. I suspected the noise the three of us made was more noise than had ever disturbed the peaceful quiet of the old temple since the days it was built, and this we learned was more than 10,000 years ago. In fact, it was so old that it looked a part of the rock upon which it rested. When we arrived on the roof, there was no need to ask for quiet. One look into my two associates' eyes and mouths went wide open. I suspect had anyone looked at mine, they would have seen the same. I waited for them to speak. Almost in one breath came the exclamation, "Why, we are surely suspended in midair." They said the sensation was exactly like that I had experienced in the other temple. They had forgotten for a moment that there was anything under the feet, and the sensation was that they were floating in midair. One remarked, "I do not wonder that these men can fly after experiencing this." We were aroused from our reveries by a laugh, and all turned to find Emil, Jas, and our friend of the record standing close behind us. One of my associates walked quickly up to them, tried to grasp all of their hands at once, and said, "This is wonderful. We do not wonder you are able to fly after you've been here for a time." They smiled, and one said, "You are as free to fly as we. You only need to know that you have the power within to do so, then use the power." We then turned to the outlook. The fog had lowered and was floating in great billowy waves just high enough so that not a foot of land could be seen anywhere, and the movement of the banks of fog all around gave the sensation that we were being carried on noiseless wings along with the fog. Standing there looking far out, one lost sense of anything underfoot, and it was very difficult to believe that we were not floating in space. As I looked out, it seemed as if my body lost all sense of weight and that I was actually floating above the roof. I had so far forgotten myself that when one of the parties spoke, my feet hit the roof with such force that I felt the effects of the jar for several days after. At breakfast that morning, we decided to stay over for 3 days, as we expected to visit only one other place of interest before going to the appointed meeting place. Upon reading the messages Emil had brought, we learned that our chief's party had visited the temple only 3 days before. After breakfast, we went out and found the fog gradually clearing. We watched it until it cleared entirely and the sun came up. We could see the little village nestling close in under the cliff in the valley far below. Our friends decided to visit the village, and we asked if we might go with them. They laughed and said we could. They thought we had better use the basket, as we would present a better appearance if we did than if we attempted their mode of travel. No sooner had the last one stepped from the basket than our friends were there. We went down to the village and spent the greater part of the day. It was a quaint old place typical of those mountain districts, with its houses built by digging into the side of the cliff, then closing up the opening with rock walls. There were in all about 20 of these houses. We were told that the houses were built in this manner to keep them from being crushed by the heavy snows in the winter. The villagers soon began to gather, and Emil talked to them for a few moments. It was arranged that a meeting should be held the following afternoon, and couriers were sent out to notify those of the neighborhood who wished to attend. We were told that John the Baptist had lived at this village and received instruction in the temple, and that the temple remained the same as when John received his instruction there. We were shown where the house had been torn down. That afternoon, when we returned to the temple, the weather had cleared so that we could see a wide expanse of country, and we were shown the trail that John had used in going to and from the temple and the different villages where he lived. The temple was supposed to have been built in the village established more than 6,000 years before John visited there. We were shown the trail we would take when we departed, and were told the trail had been in use since the temple was built. About 5 o'clock that afternoon, our friend of the records, said he would leave us for a time. He then shook hands, saying he would see us soon, and disappeared. That evening, we saw the most remarkable sunset from the roof of the temple that I have ever witnessed, and it has been my good fortune to have seen sunsets in nearly all lands. As evening advanced, a light haze was gathering over a low range of mountains that bordered a wide expanse of tablelands which we could look down upon. When the sun reached this rim, we were seemingly so far above it that it appeared as if we were looking directly down upon a sea of molten gold. Then came the afterglow, and every mountain peak appeared to be aflame. Those in the distance that were covered with snow seemed to be blanketed with fire. And where glaciers filled the ravines, it appeared as though they were shooting forth great tongues of fire. And these flames appeared to meet and melt with the different hues in the heavens. The lakes that dotted the plain below were transformed suddenly into volcanoes, belching forth fires which ascended and blended with the colors in the heavens. For one moment, it seemed as if we were standing on the brink of a silent inferno. Then all blended into one harmony of color, and the soft, peaceful quiet was beyond description. We sat on the roof until after 12 that night, asking Emil and Jess questions. These questions pertained principally to the people and the history of the country in general. Emil quoted liberally from the records. These records prove that this country was inhabited thousands of years before our history began. Emil went on to say, "While I do not in any way wish to disparage or make light of your history or of those who wrote it, I will say that at the beginning of this history, the historians did not go back far enough, but took for granted that Egypt meant what the name implied, utter darkness or the wilderness. It really meant a wilderness of thought. At that time, as now, a large portion of the world was in wilderness of thought, and they did not go back of it to get the deeper meaning. They accepted what they saw or heard, or what appeared on the surface, recorded it, and your history began. It is quite difficult to correlate the two, and I would not attempt to say that you must take ours as authentic. I would suggest that you choose for yourselves." The moon then appeared over the far-off mountains. We sat and watched it round and full until it rose nearly overhead. It was a beautiful sight, with an occasional light cloud passing by at an elevation just above us. When these clouds went drifting by, it seemed as if the moon and the clouds were standing still and we were drifting past them. This went on for an hour, when suddenly there was a noise of some object thrown to the roof behind us. We started to our feet and looked around. There stood a middle-aged lady, smiling and asking if she had startled us. Our first impression was that she had jumped from the parapet to the roof but she had only stamped her foot to attract our attention. The stillness had been so intense, we had greatly magnified the sound. Emil stepped forward quickly, greeted her, and introduced us to his sister. She smiled and asked whether she had intruded on her dreams. We then sat down, and in a short time the conversation drifted into reminiscence of her experiences. She has 3 sons and a daughter that had been raised in work. She replied that the youngest 2 were always with her. We asked if we might see them. She replied that they could come there that evening, and immediately 2 figures, a man and a woman, appeared. They greeted their uncle and their mother, then came forward and were introduced to the 3 of us. The son was a tall, erect, manly fellow, whom we took to be about 30 years of age. The daughter was not tall, rather slight, with very fine features. She was a fine, well-poised girl, whom we judged about 20 years of age. Afterwards, we found that the son was 115 and the daughter was 128 years old. They were all to be present at the meeting the next day and soon went below. After they had retired, we passed complimentary remarks about the son and daughter. The mother turned to us and said, "Every child born is good and perfect. There are no bad children. It does not matter whether they are conceived in the perfect or immaculate, or through the sense of material way. The one conceived in the perfect way will soon recognize his sonship with the Father, that he is the Christ or Son of God. Then he will develop and unfold quickly, and he will see only perfection. The one conceived through the sense way, may also immediately recognize his sonship, perceive that the Christ is in him, and may realize his perfection by idealizing the Christ. He gazes upon that ideal, loves and cherishes it until he manifests or brings forth that which he gazes upon, the Christ. He is reborn and is perfect. He has brought forth perfection from within himself, that perfection which was always there. The one held to the ideal and was perfect. The other perceived the ideal and unfolded that ideal and regained perfection. Thus no child is bad, all are good and from God." Here one of the parties suggested that it was bedtime, as it was past 12 o'clock.